Hey, so welcome to the HPS feedback webinar. My name is Emma and I'm going to be leading today's discussion. I do have a small number of slides to run through, but please do ask questions, have a discussion as we're going along. It's really important that you get all of the information that you need in order to deliver great feedback sessions to the HPS candidates. So this session really is for you. So a few objectives for the session. We do appreciate that you're all experienced assessors. So the purpose of this webinar is not to teach you how to give feedback as such, but rather to explore the elements that make this feedback process a little bit different from what you may have previously experienced. So the primary objective of this webinar is to support you guys, to support the assessors, to provide a consistent and high quality feedback experience for all candidates. The process for feedback for HPS candidates is a little bit different in that the focus is on providing helpful developmental support. So often feedback calls are used to convey a decision, but in this case, candidates will already be aware of the results of the application process. So your role is to enable your candidates to reflect on their performance, understand the feedback, and think about their development in terms of concrete next steps. The focus really is on providing that development support. Does anybody have any questions?
Not at this stage, no.
So just as a reminder, there are 3 assessment stages through the HPS application process. There's an application form, which has 5 scored questions. There are the assessment centre activities, which you all know well, and the leader potential online diagnostic. So while successful entry onto the scheme does combine the results from all 3 stages, the feedback conversation that you guys will be delivering focuses on the candidate's performance during the assessment centre. So it focuses on the interview and the role play exercise. Please do remember that this assessment process is designed to assess a person's potential to progress to the most senior levels of the NHS and to more specifically benefit from the particular learning approach of this scheme, which is primarily driven by experiential learning opportunities. So one important distinction to make is that it doesn't assess current performance, nor does it act as a limit to a candidate's potential progression either. It's really important. I can't stress this enough, even though I know you guys will all know this, but it's really critical to make sure that you've had adequate preparation before the feedback session. So we strongly recommend that you ensure that you're familiar with the candidate report and that you also review any notes that you have from the assessment centre. We'd recommend that you have to hand some really clear messages about the candidate's strengths, development areas, and some development recommendations. Please make sure that you're also prepared to provide a rationale for the selection decision. The candidate may need a further discussion about this. Most of this, you'll be able to actually take from the candidate's pre-prepared report. So as you know, a report on each candidate was produced from your notes from the assessment centre. And that report will be sent to both you and to the participant before the feedback call. So please do check with your local scheme coordinator to see who's responsible for sending this report out. For the case of staffs, Michelle, who will be sending that report to the participant? Will that be centrally organised or the assessors?
It will be Di Harrison,
okay.
Assistant Project Manager.
Okay, so the report should be sent out before your feedback call, but please do check with your participant that they have received it. Is that all clear?
Do we know when that might be, Michelle?
The feedback is meant to take place in January, so we're just finalising the reports at the moment. So that will happen either just before Christmas so that you have the notes ready, or first week in January.
Thanks.
Okay, is that all clear? Any other questions?
No, thanks.
Okay. So this is how we recommend that you approach the call. So it's a simple process. Reintroduce yourself. You will have met your candidate. Your candidate will be one of the people who you interviewed, and just remind them of the purpose of the call. And then encourage the candidate to reflect on their assessment performance. There will have been quite a gap between the candidates undertaking the centre and your feedback call. So this acts as a good prompt to bring back that experience for them. Then go into a discussion of strengths and development areas as they are outlined in the written report, and then go into a more in-depth discussion of development actions. So we do encourage you to recommend actions or activities that you think would be helpful, but also please do remember to employ a coaching approach which encourages the candidates themselves to think productively and concretely about their development journey. This is a real kind of differentiator for this conversation as opposed to your standard feedback calls. One of the key principles of the design of the HPS selection scheme was that it provides a helpful development opportunity for all candidates, regardless of whether they're successful or not. So making sure that every single candidate goes away with some clear, concrete development next steps and is enabled to progress on their development journey is really critical. And then finally, a wrap up and outline of any next steps. So a quick question for you, is this a familiar kind of process? Do you have any questions about it?
Hi Emma, it's Richard here. Just one question. It looks really good as regards to the timings. Do we have to stick by those times that are outlined on the presentation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Rich. Use this as guidance only. A really effective feedback call will go where the participant needs to go, will go where your candidate needs. So if your candidate needs some more time perhaps to reflect on the assessment experience, to accept the decision, or doesn't understand something, use the time as you best see fit to make sure that it's a rewarding experience. The times are a guideline only.
Thanks for that, Chief.
Any other thoughts or questions?
Hi, it's Michelle. Just a quick question on it says feedback call. So if a participant wanted to meet face to face and the assessor was happy with that, is that okay? Oh
yes, absolutely. I mean, often, especially when you don't know the person that well, face to face can be far more effective. It can be far easier, especially to give constructive feedback. I think we've assumed as a default position that most of the feedback sessions will be a call just because of practical logistics. But if a face-to-face is possible, I'd absolutely encourage that.
Okay, thank you.
So any other questions? Jodie, I think you've just joined us. She might be working out the audio. Sorry, Rich, did you have another question?
No, just to say, no, that's great. Thank you.
So I guess just to hand over to you guys, really, just a bit of an opportunity to spend some time just reflecting on what makes great feedback. You are all experienced feedback providers. You've all received feedback yourself. What are your what are your top tips? When have you received really great feedback, and what's made it a really positive or powerful experience?
I think for me, it's the style and approach of the feedback. You mentioned a couple of slides back with regards to it taking a coaching approach with the feedback itself. And I think for me personally, that's when I've experienced powerful feedback from somebody who's presented it in a coaching way, rather than it being in a mentoring way or quite directive way. So for me, it's certainly the coaching approach that's important, and has certainly been powerful in the past.
Yeah, that's really insightful, Rich. How many of the assessors do you think will have that kind of coaching background, that coaching experience to draw from?
Hi, it's Michelle. I think a lot of our assessors are experienced senior leaders, so they will have experience coaching in some form or other. So I think it shouldn't be a new concept, but this is where this webinar is useful, just to kind of go over the key principles again.
Yeah. So that the Leadership Academy team, I think, are going to be producing just some coaching prompt questions for if people need some inspiration over the kind of questions that can be asked. So where the webinar is published on the website, there should also be a link to some key coaching questions if you need to use them. Any other thoughts on what makes a really positive and powerful coaching experience?
Yes, being able to back it up with examples and to be able to demonstrate what, when you're given a specific piece of feedback about where they demonstrated that kind of behaviour or approach to something is always useful, to be able to relate it back to things that they actually said.
Yeah, that's really important. Try to be specific as possible. Try to use your notes from the centre to give specific examples, specific behavioural examples. Often that can be the trigger from somebody being able to move from quite an abstract feedback concept to seeing something in action, to seeing themselves in action. So yeah, thanks, Kelly. That is really insightful. Anything else?
I think just following on from Kelly's point there, I think that it's important that the person who is presenting the feedback has that preparation under their belt, and that they're not rushing into the meeting or the experience and really rushing the conversation. I know that we just spoke about timings as well, which is really good, and it needs to be done in a real timely way that's quite patient and a compassionate approach, really, because sometimes the feedback that we get can be quite sensitive to a certain degree. So it's about having that compassionate, timely approach, but being well prepared before you go in and have that conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that's true on quite a few different levels. There's something about giving yourself, the practical time to do the consideration, and so to give the feedback the due consideration that the candidate deserves, and to make sure that you're prepared for the candidate discussion. And there's also something, I guess, around making sure that you're in the right mindset to approach the feedback. As you say, Rich, if you're hurrying between meetings and kind of, got your lunch in one hand and trying to dash off a quick conversation, then again, that's not really doing the candidate justice. So there's something about making sure that you're in the best position to provide a really valuable experience. I think another thing I'd add, which touches on something you mentioned there, Rich, is around trying to establish that connection. If I think back on the great feedback conversations that I've had, it's been when my feedback provider has used that kind of like initial introductory kind of 5 minutes to demonstrate that they're really interested in me and in helping me to progress. And it helps to develop that kind of trusting relationship a lot more quickly. Any other thoughts from anybody?
And balanced feedback. So, the development areas and the strength areas, but we're capturing that through the report, so it's already a conversation starter, but I think the balance is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, I think we need to bear in mind that it's only a minority of candidates who are appointed onto the scheme. So most of these feedback conversations will be with candidates who aren't successful. So that constructive feedback element is obviously really critical, but making sure that we balance that both to, do justice to the candidate and acknowledge their areas of strength, but also to make sure that they're in a good place to be able to hear the really important messages that they get from the centre experience. Anything else? Okay, in which case we just move on just to talk a little bit about some tips to help to make the feedback conversations as successful and as helpful as they can be. So the feedback call outline is generally based on the intentional change model. The intentional change model essentially identifies 5 main steps which need to be followed if an individual wants to make a lasting change. There's discovering your ideal self, discovering your real self, then creating your learning agenda, which is focused on the insights that you gain in step 1 and step 2. You know, experiment with and practice new habits, and then access support. Nobody can do it alone. And it's certainly true that an hour's feedback call is not enough time to really work effectively through all 5 steps. But having said that, for a feedback conversation to be effective, it really does need to touch on all areas. The important focal point will be to make sure that the participant is enabled to take further action in each step following the feedback session. Are you guys familiar with the intentional change model?
A little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's something that I've used in the past, and often what I've found is that you can go around it, it's quite in a circular format, isn't it? But you can also back as well, so you don't have to go through from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, but you can jump back to cover off as well, which I think is really useful. And I think that it is a good framework to use and to structure that conversation as well.
Yeah, and I've used it in a couple of different ways. I guess I always have it in mind when I have feedback or developmental conversations. So, those 5 steps are always, key for how I kind of direct the conversation. Occasionally, actually, I've also shown it to participants. If their kind of learning style, I think, will respond to it and it won't be a distraction, I've actually kind of given this to people as well, just to help them to understand how to approach their learning journey.
I think that's a very useful point, Anna, because it certainly might help some of the candidates, especially the unsuccessful ones, just to think about what next as well.
Yeah, and it helps people to understand or to realise the importance of kind of recognising the gap between where they are and where they want to be, but also directs them into how to take action to address that gap. Any other thoughts on the intentional change model? Yep. Okay, so let's move on. Just as a quick reminder here, we all know great development conversations, they are respectful. They'll need you to put into place kind of deep, active listening skills with supportive questions, and they also provide astute feedback. I'm flagging this as a reminder because these elements will help you to quite quickly establish the trust that's necessary to have a reproductive discussion that's going to support the development journey. And we know that there are actions that a feedback provider can take to make it easier for the candidates to hear, to understand, and to action the messages that are being sent. So to help a candidate understand, try to be specific, try to provide examples, emphasising the behaviours that you observed will help the feedback to resonate and for the candidate to see themselves in action, which is, I think, what you were mentioning before. It's really critical that the feedback session helps the candidate to accept the feedback, taking action like making sure it's the right environment to help focus, ensuring a balanced conversation, providing a two-way discussion. All of these things will help to support that process. And to maximise value from the HPS experience, candidates should also be enabled to actually take development action on the basis of the feedback, regardless of whether they have been successful at gaining entry onto the scheme or not. So make sure you're focusing on the behaviours that can be changed. There's absolutely no point in giving somebody feedback to act in a way that is completely counter to their natural kind of preferences. So we're focusing on what can be changed. We're focusing on what's realistic for the individual. And we also keep the conversation focused on a small, manageable number of key development areas. We can't change the world all at once. Get your candidate to think about the top 2 or 3 things that they should be working on straight away. Any thoughts on that? Nobody's wildly disagreeing, which is good. Rich, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, just looking at it from a non-judgmental perspective as well, because I think that once again, it's a great model to use, but it's also about the feedback isn't tainted by any judgment, be it verbal or non-verbal, really, and just adhering to that as much as possible. And I think that just really comes with the coaching style, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, but yeah, really important. Absolutely. If you're going to establish that kind of relationship of trust, then, and you only have a short amount of time to build that, then you can't be passing judgment, or the candidate can't feel like you're passing judgment. Okay, so I've included this next slide in just as a simple reminder of active listening techniques, if you just want to refresh your memories. But other than that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. And then this model as well is also really helpful. It's really important, particularly from a diversity perspective, to understand that different people may have different reactions to feedback. Now, that sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but quite often we assume that people will react in the same way as ourselves. We know that that's just not the case. So this diagram here, the SARA model, demonstrates the main stages of shock, anger, resistance, and acceptance that people demonstrate when they are faced with constructive feedback. Personally, I've experienced all of these reactions in feedback conversations, as I'm sure you have, and it's not always easy to anticipate what kind of frame of mind a candidate is going to approach the conversation with. So we really do need you to be on your toes a little bit, really listening to the candidate, observing the candidate, getting an idea of the frame of mind that they're in and how to most effectively tailor your approach to make sure your messages can be heard. Candidates, as we've already said, they will have received their reports, so they already could have worked through some of this themselves. So fundamentally, they could be at any stage in this model. Your job as a feedback provider is to help the candidates to progress through these stages, ensuring that they're enabled to hear, to understand, and to act on the feedback that they receive. Are you guys familiar with this model? Have you come across SARA before?
Yes.
Yeah, this is a model that I've used before, and also, as yourself have seen, all of these elements really, when I've been presenting and giving feedback. Just one question: what if the candidate doesn't say anything, and they're difficult to engage with? What would your suggestions be?
Anybody else had that experience when they were working with a candidate who wasn't given very much to work with?
Not necessarily in feedback sessions, but in coaching sessions I have.
And what's worked for you, Kelly?
Perseverance, you just have to keep going, don't you? Ask different questions, approach things in a different way.
Yeah, so when I've had that, I guess it goes back to that kind of active listening technique, and first of all, trying to ask questions that invite a more detailed response. So there's really open-ended questions. I've also just gone back to kind of the basics and tried to just to get them talking pretty much about anything, to almost kind of open the floodgates as if it were, and to have that proper conversation. So that part of the feedback process where we said go back and talk about a candidate's reflections from the session, that's quite an easy way into encouraging the candidate to talk, because they're just talking about something that they have already done. There isn't anything that's going to trip them up or anything like that. So if you need to ask some more questions around that process to get the conversation flowing, then I'd also do that. Have you been in that situation before, Rich?
I have indeed, yes, and especially when you're working with someone who is clearly introverted as well, that it can make the session more challenging. And I think that you're right, and it's about building that trust and really opening the conversation up as much as possible, and then really starting to look at the areas of feedback. But certainly those open-ended questions support with that process of opening the dialogue up as much as possible, really.
Yeah, and when I've had candidates that have immediately appeared nervous, or you sense that they're on edge, you're not going to get a lot out of them, I've spent a lot more time in the introduction just having a chat. You know, where have you come from? How are the trains running? Isn't the weather terrible? Just something to help to break down that kind of awkwardness and make it into more of a conversation rather than a formal session. Any other thoughts on the SARA model? Okay. And as I mentioned, just bear in mind candidates can be at any point on this model. So Rich, you preempted my next slide, which is just an opportunity opportunity to brainstorm some solutions. So we've had kind of like one problem where a candidate just isn't giving you anything, not speaking, hard to draw out. Any other interesting challenges you've experienced when you've been giving feedback?
Hi, it's Michelle. I think one potential consideration is, what if the candidate completely lacks insight into how they performed in any particular part of the assessment process, and how to deal with that, really. I don't think I necessarily know the answer. I just want to throw it out there as something that that might crop up.
And what do you mean by kind of like insight? Do you mean that they can't accept the feedback that's been given, or they? Yeah.
I guess they might think they perform particularly well on a section, and it might be quite a hard message to hear if the feedback is that they didn't. So it's just how you deliver those hard messages, or the harder to hear feedback.
Any thoughts from anybody on that?
I think for me, in that situation, it's really presenting them with the feedback and the evidence to a certain degree as well, and it's using that in a constructive way, and potentially taking that coaching approach and that using the open-ended questions to gain an understanding with regards to what element they don't agree with, and the reasons why as well, and taking that compassionate approach and really to avoid being, once again, taking a judgmental side really, but just trying to dig a little bit deeper as to understanding the reasons why, despite the evidence and the feedback that's been generated, why they won't accept that. If that's something that's happened previously, or indeed something that that needs further work on, really.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So there's something about you as a feedback provider, your approach and your attitude, that kind of objective presentation of evidence without the judgment. There's something about, I guess, then having the evidence for you to draw upon, so you can refer to specific behavioural examples. And I really like that idea, Rich, of encouraging the candidate to reflect on when a similar situation might have happened in their real working life as well, to try and connect to it more. Anything else from anybody on what to do with a candidate who's struggling to accept the feedback? Sorry? Nope, thought that somebody was going to jump in there. When I have candidates who are really struggling to see themselves in the feedback, I often kind of try to take a different perspective and approach it from a sense of, right, this is what you intended, this is how you feel you performed. What you intended or how you intended to come across may not be the same way as it is landing with your audience. So try and take it to where there's a difference between your intent and other people's perception of you. And that can help to depersonalize it a little bit. So they can say, oh, well, I had the right intentions. It's, you know, it's just not landing properly. So what is it that I could do to help me come across in the way that I would like to, in the way that I intend? Is that making sense?
It does, yeah. I've often asked them, when I've been giving feedback, I've often asked somebody right from the very start is how they believe they performed during such an experience as this, such an assessment centre, and you can often gauge from that really their reaction, and it's really checking in with them with regards to their acceptance of the procedure and the process, to really just to get a gauge how they believe, and if they're adamant that they believe that they thought they went really well throughout the process, that it's really just gauging that and structuring the conversation and the feedback around that feedback that you get from those guys right from the beginning.
Yeah, that's very true. Okay, any other problems that people might have come across in feedback conversations?
I think if it's negative feedback that you're presenting, I have in the past experienced candidates who have become disengaged by the conversation.
Yeah.
They're like, it's great to hear the good stuff, but unfortunately the negative stuff can sometimes be a bit disengaging. So it's maintaining that engagement throughout the conversation.
Once they've heard enough, maybe.
Yeah, it can have to be quite difficult, really.
Sorry, Kelly, what was that?
Yeah, sorry, I was talking over Rich for a second. Just maybe when they've heard enough, or they heard something that they don't necessarily like or agree with, there's a danger of the disengaging and switching off at that point.
That's right, and one indicator of that is the body language that they use.
Yeah.
That can also be a sign, really, that they're losing interest really in the conversation. So it's just really, and you can also use that question and really start to tap into the fact that they are starting to slump up in their chair, or they're starting to be rolling their eyes, etc. And you can use that as a question, certainly from a coaching perspective. Just really to check in to make sure that the information is there, really.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason why the process that we're recommending for the feedback sessions kind of starts off in the way it does. We don't actually come on to the, should we call it constructive feedback, until quite a way into the conversation, where you've already had a chance to build a rapport, build a bit of a relationship, and you've already outlined some of the key strengths that have been seen. So all of those kind of initial steps building up to the constructive part should help the candidate to be in a more receptive frame of mind. And then I guess it goes back to the points that we were talking about before around the balance of the conversation. And if anything, the balance needs to be tipped towards the positive. And as I said, one of the key differences between this kind of feedback session and your standard feedback session is around the development focus. So I think we can be careful to make sure that we're pitching the more constructive criticism as development advice rather than, you know, you don't do this. It's more of a case of, okay, so this is what we've observed, and then this is what we think you need to go on to develop to be ready for the next stage. So I think in your preparation, I'd definitely recommend that you think about how to phrase these messages so they have that developmental focus rather than something that's just negative. Does that make sense?
Yes, right, thank you.
Any other problems? Yeah, I can't think of many. The only other one I can think of is the complete opposite end of the spectrum, which is where somebody wants more of your time, when somebody wants to dive into more details. And Michelle, I might hand that over to you. What do you want the assessors to do if they have somebody who wants a longer and more in-depth conversation?
I guess for the successful candidates, they will have careers coaches and career mentors and that support framework to wrap around them. So it'd probably be a case of the feedback assessors sort of saying, well, your contact points are you know, going to be given to you throughout the programme. For the unsuccessful candidates, if they want to talk a bit more about their development journey after their, you know, following their application, they've obviously got their line managers back in their own organisations, and also we have a contact or a lead in each trust, primarily the sort of OD leads really, that they've been informed about in their letters, who they can get in touch with to pick that up with them.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So that kind of completes our recommended feedback process for the assessment centre assessors to follow. Did you have any questions or any concerns or anything you wanted to flag?
I think for me, it's just really if the candidate is after more information, but Michelle's answered that question with regards to going back to the line manager, etc. So no, that's fine for me. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well then let me just end with a little reminder. If a candidate asks you about their potential diagnostic, the online psychometric test that they completed, they will be invited to a webinar to address feedback on this specifically, and they'll have an offer of a one-to-one feedback session. The feedback on the online psychometric can only be delivered by somebody who is trained and accredited in providing that feedback. So please don't venture down that path yourselves. They will have an opportunity to talk about that in more detail with another feedback provider. Any final questions? Okay, in which case, thank you very much, everybody, and I hope your feedback sessions go well.
Thank you.